My name is Helena, and I work at Good Shepherd Ministries. I'm the grant writer, which means that I work in the fundraising department, and I do a lot of the writing work and the statistics, applications, that kind of thing. I've been working with Good Shepherd Ministries for more than 10 years now. I really enjoy working. People on the streets can come from any age, so when we get women and children or young people, we send them to agencies that specifically serve those demographics. Covenant House takes care of young people, and the city has a number of shelters that help women, either abused women who have had to flee their homes or women who are on the streets from poverty and other reasons. So there's a whole range of people on the streets because anybody can become homeless. I mean, none of us are necessarily free from it. I mean, some of us are probably homeless at times without even noticing that we're homeless, because if we have friends and family, we can sleep on their couch. Like I had one time when I was between apartments and I stayed with my aunt for 2 months. Technically speaking, I was homeless, but I never felt like I was homeless. But if I didn't have an aunt, or if you didn't have family, and that's very easy in a place like Toronto that's filled with immigrants and people who have come here to make a living, then you might find yourself needing a place like a homeless shelter. And you might need it very temporarily, or you might need it for a longer time. So the reasons that people become homeless are usually as unique as the people themselves. Like there's no one reason why a person becomes homeless. A young person who comes to a shelter might be coming to a shelter because they're fleeing abuse at home. Or they might simply be a young person who has relocated to find work and something fell apart. Like maybe they went to stay with a friend and had a fight with a friend and the friend threw them out and suddenly they're homeless. A senior can become homeless because they've lost contact with friends and family as they got older, and they're starting to slowly suffer from dementia, and they forget some critical bit of paperwork because they're not really coping with that anymore, and they come home one day to find that the locks have been changed on their apartment. Because in a large and anonymous apartment building, that can happen. So people have all kinds of reasons for becoming homeless. People can have a bad divorce, for example, and lose their job at the same time. That can, sort of suddenly your family relationships are all disrupted and you have no money. So all kinds of things lead people to homelessness. For the rest, it really is about poverty or other kinds of illnesses or just plain bad luck. Or sometimes people are here and they know when they're getting out. For example, we had a gentleman who stayed here because of fire damage in his apartment, and he stayed here while he was waiting for it to be fixed. So those are all the different reasons a person might find themselves on the streets. For women, the reasons can be a bit different because they may have to flee at home because of abuse. For the women you see on the streets, the women who are stuck in homelessness, for far more of them than for, it's more likely for them to be struggling with mental health issues, because women typically keep better connections with friends and family, so they tend to be among the invisible homeless because they've moved in with somebody rather than ended up on the streets. Yeah. But the other thing that happens is that when women are on the streets, sadly, they're much more vulnerable to violence than men are, because they're seen as sort of fair game, and people will attack them just for sleeping outside. So it is very difficult for the women who end up on the streets, literally on the streets, and it can be a dangerous place for them. The other dangers that are on the streets are, of course, the weather. People think of the cold and freezing, and yes, that is a real danger. But there's also heat. People don't realize, especially for an older person on the street whose health is poor, maybe they have respiratory problems. Maybe they're struggling with emphysema or some other kind of asthma, and in the extreme heat, they may have difficulty breathing in places that don't have air conditioning. So heat stroke can also be a real factor for people out on the streets. Because people get wet and they can't get dry again. Their feet are wet, their coats are wet. They're in the shelter for the night, but that usually isn't long enough for your boots to dry out properly or for your socks to dry out properly. So that that kind of constant low-grade coldness and dampness can really be hard on people's health. It may not kill people immediately, but it can start small things going that trigger larger problems and can, you know, really make life on the streets very difficult. The other thing that people on the streets face is, sadly, is violence. Some people think that because someone's on the street sleeping on a bench or something like that, that they're fair game. Like there was this sad story a few years ago of the homeless man who was kicked to death near the Moss Park Armories by a couple of young reservists who'd been drinking. And they just were wandering around drunk, and they saw a man sleeping on a bench and they just attacked him. And it was particularly upsetting to the community that homeless people we serve, because he was well known and he was a very gentle man, a man who'd been a writer, you know, and he was harmless. Like there was no way he could have provoked any kind of violence, and it was a real, you know, people felt very bereft by him, by his passing. So the men who are on the streets and the women know that they may become a target at any point. People will just decide to throw things at them if they're visibly homeless, or yell, you know, we'll just look at them and yell, get a job, or things like that, not knowing anything about what it is that's brought them to the streets or whether they're able to get a job, you know. So a lot of people will think, you know, okay, what can I do? I mean, it looks pretty hopeless, especially if you're seeing someone on the streets and they're obviously suffering from huge problems, mental illness, addictions, things that are too big for, you know, like this is not somebody you can just wave a wand and magically they're going to be well again. And it seems like a huge problem. But there are a lot of people doing a lot of things that make a real difference. And at Good Shepherd, what we work on first is making sure that people can survive. So whether you're homeless for 2 days or 2 years, you've got a chance of making it back to living what we think of as a normal life, you know, with a place to call home and some loving connections to other people and a source of income, all those important things. So the first thing that needs to be taken care of for people on the streets is they need to be able to eat and find shelter and find clothing and get basic medical things taken care of before they snowball into something that's really life-changing. Start thinking about rebuilding your life. So what else do you need? Well, obviously you need clothing. And people on the streets don't have a closet or a bedroom or anywhere to store clothing. So one of the things we have to do is be able to provide people with clothing, and to provide them with clothing knowing that they're not going to be able to keep that clothing or wash it again, or their chances of doing that are pretty low anyway. So we go through a lot of socks, for example, because people really need socks. Socks are an important part. Like remember I talked about people's feet getting wet and not being able to get dry. That can cause real health problems. So getting people socks, I mean, that's one of the reasons why they always are suggesting that, because it can really help a person feel good about themselves and feel warm and avoid health problems. The other things that really help a person's feeling of dignity and self-respect are things like toothbrushes. Like if you know your teeth are clean, that makes you feel good, but it doesn't just make you feel good. There are actual real health problems that come with not being able to keep your teeth clean. Apparently there's some way it triggers heart problems among people. It's one of the things I'm reading. So that really, things like toothbrush or toothpaste, we hand out a lot of that. Deodorant, because obviously if you're on the streets, you don't want to look like somebody's homeless because maybe somebody's going to attack you, one. And number two, if you go into a mall while you're looking homeless, you aren't going to be allowed to use the washrooms. Your security guard is going to fairly quickly come and ask you to move along, please. Because malls are private property and they're allowed to do that. So you want to look like the rest of the world and smell like the rest of the world. So deodorant, razors, for example, because that's another thing for men especially. It gives them a great sense of dignity and normalcy to be able to shave, to look the way they're used to looking before they became homeless. So those are your basic needs first. And then people sometimes will take care of themselves. Sometimes, a couple of days is all they need. And bing, they get themselves back off the street.